Hi, everyone. Good evening. We've got a rowdy crowd tonight, and I love that. This is why we serve the wine before, get everybody fired up. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the Nasher's Art and Health series. I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and this evening we will focus on the impact of mental health conditions. In an 1889 letter to his brother Theo, Vincent Van Gogh said, "Work distracts me infinitely better than anything else, and if I could once really throw myself into it with all my energy, that might possibly be the best remedy." I think we'll find that to be a common theme this evening among the artists we discuss, people who continue to produce in spite of or because of issues affecting their mental health. For those of you who were not able to attend our previous sessions, we have been recording them, and the first presentation is now available on the Nasher's YouTube channel. Others will follow soon. It takes a little time, but they'll be there. I should also mention that next week will be the final art and health event of this season, which will focus on artists with visual impairments. For tonight's discussion, our panelists are Dr. Leigh A. Arnold, Associate Curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center, Dr. Mark Goldberg, Professor of Neurology and Neurotherapeutics and Associate Vice President of Institutional Advancement at UT Southwestern Medical Center and O'Donnell Brain Institute member, Dr. Anne-Marie Warren, Co-Director of Trauma Research at the Level 1 Trauma Center at Baylor University Medical Center at Baylor Scott and White Health, and Bonnie Pittman, Distinguished Scholar in Residence for the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History and Director of Art Brain Innovations for the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas. In a moment, Bonnie Pittman will begin our program. Bonnie has been a tireless force in organizing these presentations and has lent stories from her own experience to humanize our conversations. I also want to thank Donna Wilhelm, who was inspired to support this series by the biography of artist Isa Genzken, who we will discuss tonight. I hope you'll join me now in giving a warm welcome to all of our panelists.
Okay, Anna, there's only one question. Does the slide change when?
The clicker.
With the clicker. Oh, wow, this is innovation. I'm so excited because I kept turning my head when I saw the first what is it called, video. I was oh my God, no wonder I have a headache when I go home because the text was behind me. So this is much better. Wow, welcome. My gosh, there's so many people here. I'm really excited that you've taken time out of your busy days to come down to the Nasher, which is one of the most beautiful places in Dallas, and to enjoy what I think will be a very profound experience talking about the creative lives of artists, and many people talk about the mental health conditions, but I think tonight what my talk is focusing on is the resilience and innovation that comes with artists who go through these experiences in their life. And too often people think about other things when they're looking at the works of art. Oh, this depicts exactly when this happened or that happened. But I think we have to open our minds and be engaging and consider in the most joyful way, and also to understand the tragedy of their lives as they went through it. I picked the icebergs from across the street as a wonderful example of resilience. Against all odds, Frederick Church went up there and painted for 2 weeks on a little boat, and he was in amid all these icebergs. And this painting is a compilation of all of that, not just a single moment of the icebergs, but it's in 1861, before the Civil War, it was like a travel channel, and very few people had seen or experienced icebergs right up close. And as you all know, Titanic had not happened. What he added, and that's what I think is so powerful about this painting for tonight, is people couldn't grasp the comprehension of what the scale of the icebergs were. So after it had been displayed for a while, and before it went to England, he added the mast. So he added this human element into what otherwise was a cold and forbidding scene. And he added that, and that's the gift of artists, because he wanted to make a human connection. There are a lot of statistics about mental health, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but they're up here. I think one of the most one of the most important one to recognize is 1 in 5 people in the United States during their lifetimes will experience some level of mental health condition. It could be mild to very, what's the right word, mild to? More severe, right? There's a whole vocabulary that goes with giving these talks that I've had to learn, which is an important part of it, but and our different physicians are here to guide me through that. So I'm letting you read those. In the beginning of the depictions of mental health, there were a lot of artists, particularly Goya's very famous Madhouse, that went into the asylums and depicted the tragedy that was going on, the way the patients were treated, the horror of their circumstances. And another one, there's a whole series of the Rakes of Progress done, and this is plate number 8, the very last one in the series, when Hogarth is depicting a particular individual who came into the hospital, and it has become a very famous image in art history because you also see the ladies in the background viewing the patients. So it's not what mental health is today, conditions. The other story, which I think is equally important in taking it from the artist's point of view, these are people, like we know Van Gogh was at Saint-Romain, St. Paul at Saint-Romain, and he lived in this institution for over a year. And these are paintings that he did inside the institution, sort of documenting this experience in his artwork. Another surprise, I've known creativity for a long time, creative therapy, but I didn't know until I started doing research that Jake Lawrence was hospitalized for another 18 months during his time, and I'll get to his story later. So you see in the artists, their point of view, that it can be very, it represents a different perspective than the voyeur walking in, the artist experiencing the healing process, and that's very much what Jake talks about in his diaries. We're going to look at artists tonight who had Alzheimer's, depression, bipolar, substance addictions, and post-traumatic stress. And certainly Gauguin he didn't have Alzheimer's, but he pretty much had all the others. But we're not talking about him tonight because I have a limited time, but that's the next year, right? Vincent Van Gogh, I picked to start off the lecture, although he's not in chronological order. It's because I think everybody knows about his work. And you can see this very early portrait of himself depicted here on the side. And then among the very last works were the famous wheat fields, which is in Amsterdam. And people, I think, wrongly see this as the foreboding of his death, forthcoming of his death. And if you look at the whole group of paintings that he did at this time, that is not at all, like the one across the street at the DMA, it's not at all what he was necessarily depicting. This is a group of self-portraits. Van Gogh did over 40 self-portraits during his lifetime. So using himself as a subject, you can, there's a great video on YouTube that you can see if you go and look for it, on all of his portraits and how they changed over time. And I just depict a couple of examples of that. As you all know, famously cut off his ear, and there are many speculative stories about that. And then this was 1889, is very close to his death, among the last self-portraits that he did. Vincent Van Gogh also did this wonderful, he did two portraits of his doctor, Dr. Gachet. And they're very similar, almost identical. There's just, in the other one, you don't see the green leaf. But I love the quote. When he first, and I'm just going to tell, you can read it up there, and he captures, I think, Dr. Gachet in the most beautiful way. However, when he first met the doctor who treated him when he was in Saint-Rémy, he did not like him at all. He was referred to him by Pizarro, and another artist, and he just wasn't sure that this was the right doctor to be treating him. Then over time, his gentle demeanor and the way in which he engaged Van Gogh and was so supportive of his creativity and of painting while in the asylum really led to these amazing pictures. This is a picture of the garden at the hospital, and you'll see on one side an actual photograph of the hospital garden as it is today, and then the large painting, which is in Switzerland, is by Van Gogh. So they were very realistic, and they really captured the experience that he was going through being in the hospital. Famously, he had an apartment or a room on the 5th floor and looked over the landscape all around Arles. And so that led to a whole series of amazing paintings like this one, which is a close brother or sister to the very famous Starry Night. You'll see the same cypress trees, the hills in the distance. He also went down and really discovered the small things about being in the hospital, the beauty of the seasons, and of course here the spring depicted with irises and other flowers. This is a series, a couple of the paintings. All of these were done while he was at St. Paul Hospital. And this is a corridor, and the loneliness and the isolation that he felt, you can really experience looking at it with those acid colors and looking down the long corridor. He also worked, and the patients gathered, and here you see them having conversations. He was very interested in the life, the experiences of the life. And these icy cold blues are characteristic of Van Gogh, but he complements these colors with the yellow. And so these two make the whole picture vibrate and stand out. The famous Starry Night was painted while he was at in St. Paul's Hospital. And most people do not know that. They think it's, just an amazing piece out of that popped out of his mind, and it did. But for me, it's a wonderful example of the work that the artist did while he was under care, and because it's such a well-known work, a prime example of this idea that in helping to cure yourself, which he was working very hard on, and then trying to be resilient about his illness. He was at one of his most creative phases in his life. And so this was actually painted looking out the window, which did have bars on it. And you can see the similarities of the cypress tree in the hills that we saw earlier. He turned to flowers, of course, and this particularly beautiful one at the National Gallery of Art in Washington was created after he got out of the hospital, after he was discharged. And then across the street at the Dallas Museum of Art, you see the 1890, one of the 12 1890 paintings, all in the exact same format. And do you remember the crows that I showed you in the very first one? Well, this was part of that series. And if you've ever seen it, in the Wendy Reeves Room, it is luminescent in color. It's as if they're dancing. These haystacks are dancing. So that's why I think when you look at the whole series of 12, you really come away saying, no, he wasn't foretelling his death. There's great debate about whether he was shot or whether he shot himself, and I am not getting into that because the answer is nobody knows. We weren't there, and there's just endless speculation, and it's like a murder mystery in the most tragic of forms. At any rate, he did die. The thing I can confirm in the wheat fields and close to where some of these paintings were created. Edvard Munch, do you all know his work? Oh my God. Be still my heart. This is a man of tragedy. You all know this painting, right? Oh yes, the Scream. I used to have it outside my office when I was doing budget. I would post dressed it up so that everybody knew coming in what to expect. No, is the answer. What do you mean you're asking me for that? But kidding aside, this is a wonderful quote that I found in one of his diaries about how he had been before it read, how he had been in a conversation with the two people walking away in the distance, and then how he felt as a result of that abandonment. And he was very, very sensitive to that. He did a series, often Munch did series of paintings over time. So he didn't do them the way Van Gogh did, or Monet. He did them one in 1 year and then 3 years later. And they'd be very similar in composition. And this is the very famous, one of the earliest versions of The Sixth Child. And this depicts his younger sister dying and her older sister holding on to her hand. And the strokes and just the poignancy of their hands holding each other say so much about this particular painting, but this had a huge effect on Munch's life and on his work. He also got the Spanish influenza in 1919, which people don't necessarily know about, but it affected a whole generation of people in Europe and the United States. And he fortunately did not die because he went on to have a very productive career. But this is, people who had the Spanish flu were really suffering in a variety of ways. Famous Munch. Faces without, people without faces, the isolation, you see them turning back and forth without touching each other. This is the Margaret McDermott one that's across the street. If you haven't seen it, you need to go over there. It's almost as if these, the forest wall where the ground is has been clawed away and you're looking at blood red coming down from the earth. And I often think of it as a huge environmental statement. That was created with this work. It's one of the most powerful pieces that I've seen in his oeuvre. Edvard Munch, in his last days, this was a portrait he did between him of himself, and you see this very sad, sort of wistful person. This was shortly before his death in 1940. He stopped painting because of his depression and his isolation, and he had a tremendous difficulty with people. Kirchner, Anne-Marie's going to talk about post-traumatic stress, and many artists who went into the war came back. They were amazingly affected by it, of course, because and some of them were actually sent out to document the war, so that was even more terrifying because that was the purpose, that they were trying to help their countries, but to be the one documenting the tragedies in front of you in the trenches was overwhelming. Kirchner came out of Die Brücke, which is a German school, often referred to as German Expressionism, and it has these lively, angular forms that often were influenced by not only the artist's interest in creating a new form for the human body, but also Picasso and others who were creating new styles. Probably the most famous of his is this self-portrait that he did. And if you look closely, you'll see a hand is gone. That did not actually happen to him, but he saw enough others. So this is like an accumulation of other artworks that came together. And to represent himself, being on the front line was devastating to him. And so, and many of his works later were, let me see if this is working, yeah, later than that one, but were taken by the Nazis and destroyed. So there's a large body of his war works that were completely obliterated. Later in his life, when he recovered, he did have a commitment into a hospital for a while to come out of this. And then afterwards, he painted solely paintings of beautiful images in Switzerland, which is where he lived the rest of his life. And this mountain studio is a wonderful example of that scene. And it's going to reminisce to a Jacob Lawrence painting where you're looking at as a view into their lives. Otto Hicks, amazing artist that I think is far overlooked, but he started out with these very classical figures, this one based on Holbein, Hans Holbein, who did these wonderful portraits, and you can see that it's very Renaissance-like. And then he too was sent in to document the war, and I saved you from some of the most gruesome paintings that I've ever seen. If you ever want images for that, I can get them to you, Dr. Warren, but it's pretty tough stuff. And he saw the trenches, he saw the disfiguration of so many people with the yellow gas and with the bombs because new explosives were being used on the war field. This is a depiction that he did of the war after the war. And what happened was he was commissioned to do it, but he had a very hard time coming to understand how he could depict the war. And so you have the soldiers walking, you have the bomb, this bloodied and bombed scene in the center, and then on the far side over here, a soldier dragging another soldier who he's trying to save. And then of course down here, soldiers who are waiting for the ambulance to come and get them from the gases. So this was painted after he had experienced this, but you can tell even 10 years later what an impact that the war had on him. He went on to come back and start painting more fun and realistic paintings. These were again done largely for himself, but they're in private collections. Jackson Pollock. We all know him, right? You all went to the Jackson Pollock exhibition across the street 3 years ago. I know you did. He's very famous for his litany of diseases, and his wife often, Leigh Krasner, often describes the experience of being with him as do his doctors, that he would be the most joyful person in the world. They didn't know what to do with how happy he was, or he would be the angriest person in the world. And these swings were very much a part of his life and what he did. And he, of course, created these paintings that he did on the floor, as you can see, and the one across the street at the Dallas Museum of Art called Cathedral was really at the height of this creativity. I can tell you that nobody else before Pollock had painted on the floor and called it art. They might have dribbled on the floor, but they didn't call it art. He intentionally defied the rules. But, you need to think again, like Rothko and Pollock came to start these paintings after World War II. And although they weren't necessarily in the wars, they were affected by the war, which is another powerful way that artists respond. This is also over at the DMA. It's not up right now, but it's a portrait in a dream, and it's a fascinating piece by Pollock, which has his face. You can see, I'm looking at it backwards here, so the face you can see, which we see in a number of drawings, and so we know it's Pollock's face, and it sort of has a mask-like feature on half of it. And then on the other side, the black squiggles, which are very thick in some cases. There's lots of interpretation. He never wrote anything about the painting, but lots of interpretation that was a dream or that was the experiences he shared in his mind. But we know he died of substance abuse and a terrible car accident. One of my great friends in life was the privilege of knowing Jacob Lawrence for 10 years when I lived in Seattle. And Jake was an extraordinary human being, and I never knew that he had depression I knew he had been in the war in the Coast Guard, but looking at this image in 1977, that's very much what Jake was like. He had a beautiful wife. This is a rare portrait of him with Irving Penn that I just couldn't give up, so flash by. We have many examples of Jacob Lawrence's works, and you probably know the Migration series, which are 60 tempera paintings that have been reproduced over time that tell the story of the migration from the south into the north. And this happened largely around before the World War II, and it tells the different images, tell some very shocking stories about the abuse that these people went through and the desperate need for education and development. after the war, 1947, he did a series. He was commissioned to do a series. And this was about, he had been down on the front, and he made endless drawings. And then he came back and did, I think it's about 20 paintings that show his view of the experience of going through World War II. And he was also a Coast Guard on the Coast Guard. And so he rescued a lot of people and brought them onto his boat and took care of them, and this is the documentation of those. One is called Going Home. Then when he came back, Jake was very young, and in 1949, I think it is, he suffered from severe depression. He had been the first African-American artist acclaimed by the Museum of Modern Art, and they bought his works. And he had gone through this whole experience of the war, and when he came back and tried to paint again, he just couldn't do it. And so with his support of his wonderful wife, Gwen, he went into an institution in Brooklyn for 18 months. And while he was there, created a magnificent series about the life in the institution. This is about sedation. That at that time they thought we could give you pills and you'd get better. Not always true. I would love that experience. Just one pill that would be swallowable and I could take. This poignant image of depression and the isolation and loneliness that people feel and the loss of complete control, I think is so powerful to look at. And then afterwards, you can see he switched back after this commission. He switched back to these amazing, started to do this, them about what he experienced in that creativity. Earlier, we had seen the creative therapy. He really was inspired to document what was going on and how important it was. And I love the women. They're almost dancing in the therapy room while they're stringing strings. Earlier, we saw this one. And the last one I'm going to show you is Jacob Lawrence is over at the DMA, but not on view. But this was a very powerful late work, not so late, but a late work that he did, which shows a doctor healing and trying to cure a patient way in the center room. If you look in there for the lady on the red bed, and then all the way through. But what's fascinating about this for me as a person who studies color is the exaggerated use of flat planes and complementary colors, the back and forth, the purples and yellows and the reds and greens. So everything sort of punches out, and the red never changes tone. It's the same red from the beginning to the end. So he magnetizes your eyes. And this is 1964, and he went to Nigeria and had a wonderful time. So you can see the evolution of his art from these themes of tragedy to the explosion, but he was always a social historian, and that was a big part of it. And the last artist I'm going to talk about is Kusama, because I'm over time, and I apologize, but I could stop. Do you want me to stop? No, all right. All right, yes, I wanted to hear that. Resonant voice, thank you. Kusama, we had the pumpkins. How many saw the pumpkins? Yes, so excited. So she's an extraordinary story to tell. She lives in Japan, and let me see. She has a host of challenges that she deals with every day. She lives across the street from her hospital, and she gets up and she sleeps at the hospital, and then her studio's across the street, and that's where she creates. So I love this. Love this piece, and you can see she has an obsession, and there's only one word for it, a huge obsession for dots. And some of her early works were these kind of accumulations and accretions, which are pretty fantastical. And there's a great quote about how uncomfortable she was sitting in these chairs. The whole notion, well, she didn't actually sit, but the whole notion, she wanted them to look uncomfortable because that was how she felt. And so this was a visual expression of that. Her dots, this was early works for her dot series. And then she started creating these amazing rooms, which have been on view at the Hirshhorn and other museums. But you can see dots everywhere. And Yayo is there. And here, I love this. This is the quote I was thinking about earlier. I am deeply terrified by the obsessions of crawling over my body, whether they come from within or outside. I fluctuate between feelings and reality and unreality. I think it says it all for her work. And there she is sitting in an installation with her pumpkins. And of course, these were when the DMA had the pumpkin installation. So, okay, one more. Aftermath, sorry, you have to go see these. And this is one of the newest installations that she's done up at the Museum Institute of Contemporary Art. And they're, guess what, based on dots. And so they're very, very whimsical shapes. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there are a lot of artists I didn't cover, so don't raise your hand and say why. It was a curator's choice, and I wanted to give you a range of people and to also complement what Anne-Marie is going to talk about with PTSD. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and we're going to rush right on to Leigh.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for bringing this program to the Nasher. It's quite a thing to share a stage with such intelligent people. I've learned quite a bit just in the process of putting this panel together. So I'm going to talk through 3 different artists who are well represented throughout Dallas collections and the Nasher collection across the street at the Dallas Museum of Art, or perhaps have a good relationship with the Nasher, as is the case with Isa Genzken. And I think today's panel, the discussion of persons who have mental conditions, it gets to the heart of a lot of stereotypes that we throw around when it comes to creatives. You know, the crazy artist, the hard-drinking artist, the artist who always has a good time, or the artist who always has to be high to make his or her best work. And I think that's obviously not the case. These are really sensitive issues, and as we saw from the statistics that Bonnie shared, impact far more lives around the world than we might imagine. So Willem de Kooning, like Jackson Pollock, he lived hard, and he was active in the 1950s and 1960s as a painter at the Abstract Expressionist group, and he was well known for his brilliant draftsmanship, and he was really counted or considered as one of the founders of the Abstract Expressionism. What kind of set him apart from Jackson Pollock was the fact that some of his work tended toward representation. So he made a series of paintings. Let's see if we have any. Here we are. Based on the figure of the woman. And in abstract expressionism, that the very part of the title abstract expressionism is this fact that it's abstract. So here he is kind of abstracting the idea of what a woman is. Before we get too much further into Willem de Kooning, we should go back and just mention that in addition to his substance addiction, later in life he was experiencing signs of dementia and was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So for about the last 10 years of his life, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and living with that. There's a marked break kind of in his style, and that many people attribute that to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Up to the mid-1970s, early 1980s, Willem de Kooning painted almost exactly as you see on the slide here. Very expressionistic, a broad use of colors. The color palette is quite light, but also varied. I think when I was in graduate school, one of my fellow students described Willem de Kooning as using the best fucking pink, like he had the best pink. So, but he didn't always do representation. He also did, of course, abstract expressionism. This is in Marguerite Hoffman's collection, which will go to the DMA eventually. But again, dense, but also loose in its brushwork, and fairly emotional when you look at his paintings. He turned to sculpture in the late 1960s, and we at the Nasher are lucky to have, I think, maybe the largest holding of Willem de Kooning sculpture in the world. And that's in large part due to this group of bronzes that we have, some of which are on view at the warehouse currently. He turned to sculpture while living for a period of time. He was in Rome for a brief stay, and his friend kind of turned him on to the idea of working with clay, which he found the texture of clay to be quite similar to the texture of painting. And so the gestures that he was able to force into clay really translated from what the gestures that he had been working with in his painting. So you can see these 12 sculptures on the screen now are hand size. These are forms that he just took bits of clay and mashed them together, pinched the clay. When you look at them, you can see the fingerprints. You can also see in certain cases where he wrapped clay around a Coke bottle, for example, or an electrical box. So you get to see kind of the way that he worked in a very direct way with this material. And I think it was this kind of hands-on notion of really manipulating the material that attracted him to making sculpture. And then he, encouraged by Henry Moore, he decided to scale up his sculpture. So we have Seated Woman out in the garden. It's currently on view, although I think the garden's dark tonight, so you'll have to come back to visit us. That Seated Woman is an enlargement of this one right here. I was going to make you guys guess, but I won't torture you. So here you see kind of a marked difference in his painting. I should mention that he was a hard drinker, and he spent many a night at the Cedar Tavern alongside his friends and colleagues and painters, drinking heavily. And it was a problem that started to become his friends became aware that this was not just having a few drinks at the bar. It was affecting not only his lifestyle, but he was no longer eating. He would have multiple blackouts, resulting in over-drinking, and his health was just in general decline. He and Willem de Kooning, his wife, were married for many years, but they spent a large part of their marriage separated. And it wasn't until 1974, 78, somewhere around the mid-1970s, his alcoholism had affected him so much that she came back into his life and helped him become sober. So in 1978, he becomes sober officially, and his painting style still kind of he still retained a lot of the qualities of painting. When he's diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the mid-1980s, that diagnosis was kind of met with a little bit of controversy, and that people were seeing this difference in the shift in his painting style and wondering, is it really possible to attribute that to his cognitive decline, or are these the paintings of another person in his studio? So I think maybe we can talk about what that means, and if you can really attribute a shift in painting style. I think it's absolutely possible. But I read somewhere about the kind of argument against these are Willem de Kooning paintings. And the argument for that is they said he had something called bodily knowledge. Mm-hmm. So he would, even if he was in a cognitive decline, his body still knew the actions that he needed to make in order to create similar gestures. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can also talk about that, if that's a real thing. And this work is in the Nasher collection. We show it occasionally in our lower level galleries, but a really great example of kind of this later work by Willem de Kooning, later painting. Isa Genzken, who has work across the street in the Dallas Museum of Art, and most recently was honored by the Nasher Sculpture Center as the 2018 Nasher Prize Laureate. She's roughly the same generation as the next artist I'll speak about, Christopher Wilmarth. But she's still living, she's still producing art at quite a frantic pace, and she experiences bipolar disorder and has suffered from alcoholism. So here we have a case of an artist who I think for many years her bipolar disorder was not really recognized, because it either had not pronounced as such, or perhaps she was masking it through alcoholism and substance abuse. Isa Genzken was born in 1948, so imagine a German artist being born right at the end of the war and having to kind of take on all of the trauma and guilt that came with being a German living in post-war Germany. She financed her art career as a young age when she was younger as a model, so I included the image on the left to kind of show you Isa Genzken in the heyday of her modeling career. And her early work, she made very precise wooden sculptures with the help of computer technology. And she's one of the first artists actually to use a computer to make sculpture, to make art, period. She studied kind of all over Germany before she ended up at the Dusseldorf Academy, where she met her husband her future husband, the painter Gerhard Richter. And it was kind of through her relationship with him that she was able to kind of get exhibitions and shows and galleries. But I should say that her art kind of stands on its own. These sculptures are incredibly intense to make. As you can see, the scale of them, the image of Isa holding one in her arms, they're anywhere between 12 and 15 feet long. They're not very round, so they're not terribly heavy, but the technical demands of making them were quite intense. Not only was she working with a computer, she had the help of a computer engineer at a nearby university who was helping write the code, but she was the one who was telling them, now I need it to be this dimension or that dimension, and then hand carving these in wood. So quite intense. And I think after making several of these sculptures, she really had enough and really wanted to loosen up a little bit. So she goes through several different, periods, I suppose we could call them, or iterations of making, and we don't have time to cover them all because quite honestly, it's quite immense. She worked in a variety of media, not just sculpture, but photography, collage, film, and I won't go into everything, but I will say that immediately following these intensely precise sculptures, she turns to concrete, which is a material that, if you think about the history of Germany and also the rebuilding that was happening in Germany after the war, concrete is a very important material. And so she was using concrete to make these scale models of buildings. So this work you see is across the street at the Dallas Museum of Art, but more recently on view here at the Nasher Sculpture Center earlier this year. And I like this installation shot because you get an idea of the vast differences in her body of work. The sculpture, of course, the concrete sculpture, the very earliest work on view, but the other two are from roughly within 5 or 6 years of each other, 2012 and 2006. And you can see there's not so much formal similarity, but there's an interest of hers of kind of capturing everyday life. And for her, that included things that she would find on the streets or things that she lived with, like the Saarinen chair, but also this work on your left, your right? Right. Sorry. Is kind of an homage to, the title is Hallelujah New Museum. It's an homage to the New Museum building in New York City, which had just opened at the time it had opened in 2007 when she had participated in a major exhibition there, and she was kind of considered the grande dame of that exhibition, despite being the oldest artist of any of them. It was kind of an exhibition of more emerging artists, but she was included because she has been such an important touch point for a lot of younger generations of artists. So it resembles the architecture of the new museum, and architecture is something that is very important to Isa Genzken. The chair that you see on your left. Gosh, no, I'm not going to get that right. Sorry. Is in a collection of Howard Wachowski. It's currently on view at the Warehouse, and again, another example of Isa pulling together highly disparate materials to create something that for her resembles everyday life. And some images of her installation at the Dallas Museum of Art, which hosted her major career retrospective in 2013. And so Isa Genzken, she's never officially come out with her diagnosis of bipolar disorder. She does speak about it. There's never really a moment where you can identify it because she is such a protean artist. Her style and her materials change so frequently. So it's an interesting case to look at Isa Genzken because it's not like Willem de Kooning where you can say, aha, that's when it changed. For her, it's changing all the time. But she did attribute her alcoholism to the divorce that she experienced, that she went through with Gerhard Richter, saying that it was such a difficult experience that she turned to alcohol to kind of self-medicate or to kind of move beyond that. And it was kind of at that point too that she was really trying to separate not only from her marriage, but separate from her identity as Gerhard Richter's wife. She wanted to become Isa Genzken. And so that I think weighed very heavily on her. She had a love of New York City and she would visit the city very often, but I think at the moment when she's going through alcoholism was a very dangerous time because she was also experiencing bipolar disorder. So on days when she was low, she would maybe go on benders that would result on her living on the street for several days at a time and kind of going off grid. And it became increasingly concerning to those around her. She is in treatment. She, as someone living with bipolar disorder, she will be in treatment most likely for the remainder of her life and will go through these highs and lows and have those good days and those bad days. I had the pleasure of visiting Isa Genzken in her studio in Berlin a year ago, and it was kind of a precarious situation in that we were working with one of her closest friends and colleagues, and who told us on the moment before we were walking up to the door, said, I don't know if she'll answer the door. We don't know if she'll be on a good day or a bad day. We just have to wait and see. And it was a great day. She was amazingly clear, had a complete control of the conversation, and was working. I mean, everything we saw in her studio was brand new. So this is an artist who's still incredibly active and working every day. There's a lesser known body of work that she made, and sorry I didn't include an image of it, but she photographed herself in the hospital. So she does acknowledge, even in her own work, the role that her conditions how they've affected her, and kind of her own body and her image and how that's affected through that photography. Starting in around 2012, roughly 2012, 2013, roughly around the time of her major retrospective, she turned completely to the figure. And so these are what she calls Schauspielers, which is the German for actors. And these actors figure prominently in many of her installations to this day. They often wear clothing of Isa Genzken, so she considers them kind of as proxies that she gets to kind of send out into the world. And here's a nice, the slot machine, it's the Spielautomat, which is German for slot machine. Isa Genzken is the image at the very top. So it's a kind of a self-portrait. And some examples of some very large scale. So as you can see, of just the slides I've shown you, the quite different periods of her work. And the final artist I'll speak about is perhaps lesser known. Christopher Wilmarth was a sculptor who's just a few years older than Isa Genzken, although tragically he died by suicide in 1987. He lived to 44. And there's not a lot written about his situation and the condition of depression, but his wife has acknowledged that at the time of his death, he was getting treatment for depression. Christopher Wilmarth was best known for making post-minimalist or minimalist sculpture, working in steel and glass. He was born in California, but he studied at the Cooper Hewitt and spent the remainder of his life in New York. And it was in New York that he was kind of trying to bring what he felt was so important to him, which was light, into Manhattan. So taking the light that was such a big part of his life in California and bringing that into Manhattan, which in Manhattan in like the 1970s was not such a light place, right? And so So he used etched glass and steel, so materials that are quite disparate. You know, steel is something that's very strong, durable, lasts forever. Glass, on the other hand, is incredibly fragile. One wrong move and it'll shatter. And he would bring them together in incredible sculptures that really evoke an atmosphere and a ethereality, which is surprising given the heftiness of the steel. And they're just remarkable works of art. This is the previous slide and this slide are two works that are in the Nasher Sculpture Center's collection. This work has never been on view before. It's currently up at the warehouse installation. And again, an example of this ethereality, which I see so much in Christopher Wilmarth's work. From a frontal view, this sheet of glass kind of gives you the feeling that you're looking into a seascape or some type of horizon line. But then when you take a step to the side, that sheet of glass, which is etched, completely solidifies and becomes something else. And this is this very transformative thing that I think happens when you look at Christopher Wilmarth's work. Across the street at the Dallas Museum of Art, there's also a Christopher Wilmarth, which I've never seen, and I'd love for them to take out of storage someday. Perhaps we can get all of them together in an installation. So towards the end of his life, Christopher turns more to printmaking, drafting, drawing, but also shapes and forms that we relate more to the body, to blown glass heads, and like these two images that I'm showing you here, which may perhaps be related to his depression, although I would hesitate to ever read anything into an artist's work without knowing whether or not that artist would approve. But there is this kind of shift from this very kind of hard-edged minimalist style sculpture to something that you would see on your right. This one. Yeah, great. Before I go to Anna, I just wanted to end with Christopher Wilmarth. He gave a really lovely quote, which he said, "Art," and this is him writing in 1974, "Art exists for a reason. The reason is simple and often forgotten. Art is man's attempt to communicate an understanding of life to man. To give in a sculpture what I understand, to imbue concrete things with parallels to human feelings, to do this in a real way, to be believable in my purpose." Thank you.
All right, well, it's an honor to be here, and I have to warn you ahead of time. You've seen these beautiful, beautiful slides. As a psychologist and researcher, my slides will not be as pretty. So I'm warning you now, don't hold that against me. So I've been at Baylor University Medical Center at the Baylor campus for, it'll be almost 20 years. And this has been my home, and it's an honor to speak with you guys tonight about trauma and resilience. I hope to leave you with more information on resilience and less on trauma. And I hope this does not traumatize myself by doing the public speaking. So what is trauma? So does anyone recognize this picture? People know what this is. If you're not familiar, this is unfortunately the night of the Dallas police shootings, and us, along with my colleague, Dr. Goldberg at UT Southwestern at Parkland, our two hospitals were in the middle of that trauma. And so when I think about the word trauma, we use the word to say something very distressing. We also use it to describe injury. And this picture always is something that kind of is very emotional, I think, to those of us that were involved with the events that happened. But what we're going to talk about is that trauma and how we view it is very personal. And that's part of how we respond to trauma as well. Now, I'm not going to bore everyone with this, but if you've ever seen this before, DSM-5, I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. So some psychology majors perhaps in the room. This is considered, it's a big giant book of every kind of mental health disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit about PTSD, but I want to spend most of my time talking about resilience, okay? So PTSD, we use this term a lot. People hear PTSD, we talk about it, but you really have to have a traumatic event to have PTSD. And this is something that, Bonnie touched on earlier, that for some of these artists, they may not have had a trauma themselves, they may not have had their own physical injury, but the witnessing of others' trauma, it can actually produce PTSD symptoms. So whether you experience it, witness it in person, have a close family member that has trauma, these put you at risk. And I might add one thing. The definition of PTSD keeps changing. DSM-5 keeps changing. That's our latest version. This used to be called shell-shocked after World War I, moved into combat fatigue. But what's interesting, and I'll bring this point up, is that when we talk about trauma, the definition used to say it was a unique experience. But I'm going to tell you in a minute that trauma is not unique to all of us. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the types of trauma. I'll just point out on this slide. It's kind of a busy slide. But what I want to point out is that not everything that's stressful gives you a potential for a PTSD diagnosis. So when we're really, truly looking at PTSD, there are certain kinds of trauma that put us more at risk. So just because you had a difficult experience does not necessarily mean you have PTSD. I will not, again, belabor this. You can read this on your own, but there are certain criteria we see after PTSD. Everyone thinks about the nightmares, the flashbacks, the exaggerated startle response, the insomnia. In our level 1 trauma center where I am on a daily basis, these are some things we're looking for the early symptoms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we try to intervene so people don't get to a point where they have a PTSD diagnosis. Now, this is what I want to touch on. In the United States, if we look at the statistics, about 90% of us will experience a trauma. But this is really important. 90% of us have trauma, but look at the rate of actual PTSD. It's small, 7.8%. Now compare that, of course, to war veterans, right? That's understandably higher. But compare that to individuals, if you see the slides, so we see about 15.7% from Iraq and Afghanistan met PTSD criteria. But on the third bullet point, we look at physical injury, so the folks that I see on a regular basis, the rates are more like 20 to 40%. So I think what we see is fortunately for our individuals in the military, they are, what do you think the difference is between, I'm sorry, I'm a big audience participation. It's more interesting than me just blabbering up here. What do you think the difference is? Why do you think the rates might be higher in an individual has a car wreck and has a horrific orthopedic injury versus someone who's in the military? Why is that higher? Yes, sir. Multiple things. Yeah, exactly, right? So you don't expect, as a civilian, if I leave the Nasher this evening, I don't expect to be shot. But so I don't have those coping things in place, right? The military is a little better job than civilians on that. So just be aware that there's a lot of potential exposure. But again, we're going to get to the part where we're going to get out of trauma. So what's the difference? Okay, this slide didn't come out the way exactly I wanted it to. If it had done it right, then it would have done something different. Anyhow, the point is, the main difference, it's going to do it, wait. Okay, it's going to do it, I apologize. You see this big orange tall, right? There's a difference between people who naturally recover from trauma and people who have chronic PTSD. And if you take anything from the talk, here's the difference. Avoidance. So let me give you a super quick scenario. You're driving in a car. You have a car wreck. You have a bad car wreck. And you say, I'm never going to get in a car again. What is that going to do? That's going to keep those trauma memories going. So what do you think we do for people who say they're in the trauma center? They say, Dr. Warren, I don't want to leave the hospital. I don't want to get in the car. What do you think I tell them? Get in the car. Now, it's a little more sophisticated than that, but this is the short version. So just remember, we don't want to avoid trauma memories because that perpetuates the symptoms. So really quickly, if you want more information, my favorite website for more information about PTSD is the National Center for PTSD. They have wonderful, wonderful information about trauma. But here's what we know. There are some evidence-based strategies that work to help with PTSD. Another important take-home message, PTSD is treatable. The primary treatments are prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR. What do they have in common? They are something that you process. You don't avoid. You talk about it. You process it in a safe place. And this will relate to art in a second, believe it or not. Medications are also indicated, but the gold standard is the processing. So,
what's EMDR?
Eye movement desensitization therapy, yes. So I apologize, EMDR. So EMDR has similar components of processing, but they add another kind of visual component, which we could get into in a lot of detail. But basically, We could get into a debate about what is considered gold standard. The first two, PE and cognitive processing therapy, are the highest gold standard. They have the highest amount of evidence. EMDR is gaining in evidence in terms of therapy. So it's just important to know that these are treatable conditions. So this is what's interesting, though, where it gets to the art, which is where everyone is here tonight. We are finding that new therapies are potentially augmenting traditional therapies for PTSD. This very interesting article in the Journal of American Medical Association 2018 found that written exposure therapy was actually almost equally as effective as the processing or talk therapy. And what's also interesting, and as a psychologist, I think, well, that's going to put me out of business. But no, seriously, it's why is that? Because what people are doing is they're writing about the trauma. They're not avoiding, they're processing. But increasingly, there have been studies that are showing that art therapy is being effective for trauma. Why? Because there are parts of the brain, and Dr. Goldberg can do a much better job discussing those brain parts than I can as a psychologist, but he will do a better job of that. But we think art may tap into parts of the brain that talking about things can't. The visual parts of trauma, the sensory parts of trauma, there's something about art that may do that. And I'm gonna give you a wonderful example. If you look at Healing Soldiers, National Geographic has a wonderful website. And what happened was at Walter Reed, there was an art therapist, and she started working with the soldiers coming back and making these masks. They gave them plain masks. They said, create what you're feeling. And they were using this with individuals with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And they made these phenomenal masks. And now the National Endowment for the Arts is working with Walter Reed. They're expanding the program. But what they're finding is these soldiers coming back are able to express the trauma of what they went through in a very different way than they could doing traditional PE or CPT therapy with a psychologist or psychiatrist. So I would encourage you to look this up because it's fascinating. Okay, so I'm gonna try to go fast. So more importantly, so we've talked about trauma, but I really wanna spend time talking about resilience because we use the word resilience all the time, but what does it mean? And I will say as psychologists and researchers, historically, we have done a focus on pathology, but in the recent decades, we're focused on positive psychology because I really want to know how does someone recover from trauma, right? So I'll read you this definition from American Psychological Association. It's what is resilience? The process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant stress. It means bouncing back from difficult experiences, okay? But my favorite definition, and there's a bunch of definitions of resilience, my favorite definition is Dr. George Bonanno, and he says an individual's personal qualities and skills that enable them to flourish, not just adapt, but flourish in the face of adversity or a disruptive event. And I think that's really powerful, right? Because it says we don't just get through an event, we actually can flourish from an event. Maybe one of the most important take-homes too, when we said in the beginning, what is a trauma? And everyone probably had a mental image in their mind, what's traumatic to them. How we frame our events is what determines whether something is traumatic or not. So we can take two people, they have the same difficult life event, and you know this in your own life, right? You see two people who go through a tragedy. One person does great with it, one person does not do great with it. And why do we think that is? It's because the way they frame or their perception of the event. And I think, again, with the artists that we've talked about this evening, that's a great example of that. Now, this is a really busy slide, but here's the take-home message. Okay, see on the, I don't have a pointer, but the up and down, disruption in normal functioning, this is after a traumatic event, and Dr. Bonanno kind of published this first, and they studied all these people after different traumas. And what they found, you kind of see this bottom line that says resilience, that most people after trauma, they have a little bit of disruption. So in other words, they might have a couple symptoms, but most people get back to homeostasis. They get back to normal life events. Very few people end up in that top box, which is kind of that chronic, like they get symptomatic and they stay symptomatic. And then there's some people that have a lot of symptoms and they recover. But here's the take-home message. If you learn anything from what I talked about tonight, most people are resilient after trauma. It's just that simple. Most people naturally are resilient. And of course, everyone is familiar with this picture. Dr. Bonanno was one of the researchers. He's at Columbia Teachers College in New York. So he studied people 6 months after 9/11. And this is a quick summary of his research from that study. But he found that 65% of those individuals who went through 9/11 ultimately 6 months later were still resilient despite what happened. So I think his work is a really powerful example of resilience. Finally, ways to enhance resilience. I will tell you there's a lot of debate in the scientific literature. Is resilience an inherent thing, like are we born resilient? Or is it something that we can adapt, modify, and grow? And I think it's a little bit of both. But there are some ways to enhance your resilience. And I think some of the most important ones are that first one, making connections, having social support. We know that's resilience. And actually, by the way, one of the reasons we talk about people who have a lot of social support have less PTSD and other mental health conditions. Think about what I said about exposure and processing. Why do you think that is? If you have more social support, why are you going to have less mental health symptoms? You're not alone, and you're what? You're talking about it. Yeah, you're processing it. And then the rest of these are important too. You know, it's just how you look at what happens, you know, making actions, having a plan, reacting in a positive way. There's things we can do, and taking care of yourself. That's probably one of the most important things. When we go through something traumatic, we forget for self-care. And at the hospital, I'm constantly telling families of those in the ICU, you've got to take care of yourself so you can take care of other people. Another take-home message. And finally, I'll leave you with this quote. This is from a spoken word poet, but I thought it was really beautiful. If your heart is broken, make art with the pieces. So thank you for your time.
Wow. Okay, I'm just overwhelmed with the art and the beauty and this wonderful series, and I'm so pleased to be allowed to be part of this, and we have such a wonderful and interactive audience. I am a neurologist by trade. I take care of patients who have strokes, but I work also at this Peter O'Donnell Brain Institute, and it gives me the opportunity to interact with other physicians and scientists, and we look at the brain as something which experiences disease, but we also work together and try to understand the cells that make up the brain, the neurons and the cells that do that, and even the molecules that go into that. And we help to try to understand where the diseases come from, what are the molecular and cellular and circuit basis of, and what can we do to try to prevent those. What does this have to do with art and creativity? Let me share that with you. So we heard about people who had diseases like depression. We heard lots of depression. Dementia, we heard Kooning. Psychosis, I didn't know exactly. Certainly Van Gogh had that, and many others as well. And then all kinds of other things. The great artist Close has face blindness, among many other things. He can't see faces and paints them all the time. And then we have so many more things. At the top of your screen, you've got things like anxiety, addiction, autism in the bottom, stroke, headache, epilepsy, Parkinson's. All of these things are disorders of the mind and the body and the spirit, but also I think the point I want to make today is these are all brain disorders. And that's, I think, a perception and a view that these things are brain disorders, not something that many of these artists would have experienced when they were alive. I'm sure Van Gogh is not thinking my brain is disordered. I think a lot of people think these are disorders of character. Addiction is a problem of habit. And these are not the new perception, the one that I think we can all embrace, that these are actually common problems of the brain, is a different kind of way of looking at things. And I think this is a modern way and maybe a healthy way, as long as we remember there's more to it than just the brain. But I want to share with you some perspectives about the brain and see if we can bring this into our conversation about these artists. So, and also I'm going to be showing a lot of pictures that are data from myself and my colleagues, and one of the people who will be contributing, a number of them, is self-portrait here. This is her brain, Dr. Davenport, Elizabeth Davenport. So I think it's an awesome self-portrait to complement all the guys, the crazy guys that are on this picture. So here's the question, and I'm going to spend as much time as I can. I got one thing to ask, okay? This is, I assigned myself this. How can these artists that we heard of be so creative in the face of what are clearly serious, maybe catastrophic brain disorders? How is that even possible? if I am in a car crash and I can't walk, my running time is going to go down by a lot. That's not happened here. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of physical disabilities and all kinds of things which prevent people from doing the things that they want to do, and yet that's not what we experience here. And these are geniuses, okay? They're not like everybody else, and yet there's something really fascinating. So I've got 4 answers for you. I think a couple of them may be true. All right, let's do it. Let's do it that way, and I know for sure one's not. Okay, so here goes. So I want to give you some background. And these are just some common things we can all agree on, I hope. Creation and appreciation of art are universal human experiences and also uniquely human experiences. It is easy to find animals of all kinds that think creatively and solve problems creatively, but hard to find ones that make art. And in my lab, the mice we have, they like peanut butter, they don't like Picasso. It's not clear that they see the work they do as artistic. So we think of this as a uniquely human experience that we can all share, but universal as well. Another thing we can all agree on is that nature and nurture interact to yield a range of artistic abilities. And our experience says a lot about the kind of art that we'll appreciate. And just to prove it, we have the great Bonnie Pittman instructing our medical students about the act of observation. So here are grown-up people being doctors, and they're learning from Bonnie in ways that have been life-altering to them, how to see the world in a different way. And so clearly, our minds can change and we can learn about art as we go. And the last thing is, the tools we have for modern imaging, such as MRI, can see inside the brain when it's working, and because of that, we've been able to learn some things about which brain areas happen when, and maybe we can learn some things about what's involved in actual artistic expression. We actually have some tools, not me, I work on stroke, but my colleagues and other people, and I want to share that with you. Okay, so, we're going to start with the very beginning here. Let's start with the brain. Okay, everyone's seen a brain, and this is just a human brain which has been cut at an angle, so the nose is at the top of the screen and the back of the head is at the bottom of the screen, okay? And the brain has got gray matter, we can all agree. You can see that edge around the outside, that's the gray matter, and what's in that are the brain cells which we call neurons. They're not the only kind of brain cells, but they're the active ones, okay? And in the middle, everyone knows there's the white matter, and this is the wiring, the axons. And the reason it's white is because our axons, these tiny little thread-like connections which connect one neuron to the next, to the next, to the next, they have a wrapping around them, some insulation called myelin. It's white and shiny. And that's why we have white matter and gray matter. Don't think about the gray matter as the thinking part, because you need the whole thing to think, and I'll get back to that in a minute. All right, so we're starting with the very basics. All right, here goes. A true fact, we all know this, we use only 10% of our brain. Now, mine's kind of used, and so I'm down to 7.6. Okay, so, all right, ready? Fact or fiction? Fiction. What's the actual amount? More, right? Like all of it. How did this concept come about? Why? I mean, we need to just get right to the bottom of this. No one's exactly sure where this idea came from. There's something a little bit true about this in my line of work, which it is possible to have an injury to the brain and not even know it. And is that because we weren't using that part of the brain? I don't think so. I think it's because our brains are enormously adaptable, and our brains can sometimes work around things. And so just as in many other things, many here are working with a physical disability and still getting to work and to everywhere they need to be. And I think that the idea that there's parts of the brain you don't ever use is completely a myth. And so we'll start with the idea that we're just going to get rid of that idea altogether. Okay, so now we're going to do some education here. How does the brain make art? Okay, and the answer is, in the most simple way of the brain, the way that we all learned in school once upon a time, each part of the brain does different things. Now, this is a total simplification. I'm going to prove it to you in just a minute. But for sure, in green, tealish, there is the part of the brain called the primary motor area, and when that part of the brain says move your hand, you move your hand, okay? There's a part that does the hand, there's a part that does the face, the trunk, the legs, there are different parts. Location is everything, where that is, and if you happen to have a stroke, for example, in the area that just get to your hand, you'll be weak in your hand, and we'll have a conversation about that. So in order to be a great painter, you want to be able to use your hand, and you also need to be able to sense where things are. If you want to see stuff, you need the back of your brain, the occipital lobe, for vision. And you need coordination, which your cerebellum does, and you need to remember what it is you need to remember, and you need to have some good judgment about what you're doing. All of that stuff is what you might need if you set out to paint a painting or make a sculpture. You gotta have these things, and if you don't, you're going to have to adapt in some way, okay? It doesn't really get at the art part of this, okay? Everything I've said is kind of basic, but doesn't really get at what was going on in these artists' lives at all. Okay, now there is something actually quite good, which is how do we all enjoy it? And the assumption would be that the reward pathways that we all know that involve secretion of dopamine in certain areas from one to another, those things which we enjoy when we have love and when we have food that we like, that brain area must surely be activated when we see a painting. And to be honest, I can't prove what happens in visual art because it doesn't sort of happen in a moment. But once a year with the symphony, we do a symposium on music and the brain. And it turns out we can actually answer some of these questions about music because music happens moment by moment. And so we actually know exactly what part of the brain lights up when you listen to music. And look where it is. Wow, it's right where you would think it would be. It's the same pleasure circuit. But not all music will do that, okay? It's gotta be jazz. If you like jazz. But it's gotta be classical if you like classical. It's gotta be rap if you like rap. It's gotta be the music you like. Otherwise, nothing happens. And so this idea that music or art will be therapeutic is not true. It can't be, that can't be right. You can't make someone suddenly love abstract expressionism. You're gonna have to find the art that you grew up with and the music you grew up with. And if you have those connections, then yes, this lights up. And so even though I don't have data for this on visual art and looking at the sculpture garden in the Nasher Center, I'm damn sure it's true. It's gotta be true. So, okay, so I told you lots of stuff, but what I didn't say was where the creativity was, okay? Notice I'm not saying what creativity is because I'm not going there in this place, but I'm saying where is the creativity in the brain? Because you could imagine the creativity center, and if you knock it out, then you suddenly can't be creative anymore, right? So that's kind of how we discover stuff in my line of work. You find out what happens when someone has a lesion and see that they suddenly can't make color pictures or can't recognize that they have a hand on this side or those kind of things that Oliver Sacks liked to write about. So you'd think that you'd have some creativity centers and that would be the answer. So we gotta know where this is. Well, fortunately we know, everybody knows. Okay, here it is. You got your left brain, you got your right brain, okay? I live here. I am the most left brain person in the room, I guarantee it. I know that this stands for propane, okay? And I don't do art and colors and all that, and I'm happy if my shoes match. So here's the deal. The right brain is the creativity center. Everybody knows this, and therefore these artists must be people who have ginormous artistic, creative right brains. Okay, here we go. Fact or fiction? Fiction. Not even a little bit true. Okay. It's a concept, and it's a great way to consider who we are as people, but not actually, our brains don't work that way. Now, it is true that our brains do some different things on the left and right side, and one side takes care of language, and one side does take care of things like spatial relationships, all good. But the creativity, wasn't there. So, some people just have super creative right brains. Turns out, not one of the four answers, or it is one of the four answers, but not a right answer. Pretty sure. All right, so here is a different answer. And I'm so proud of these until Anna said, you know what I noticed about you guys? Whenever you have a brain, you just make it turn around like this. And I want to say, it is the coolest thing I own. And I have some I could make you wear 3D goggles and you can wander through it, but it might make you sick to your stomach. Well, this is a picture also from my colleague Elizabeth Davenport, and this actually shows the mammoth set of connections. And what is really interesting is what sets the human brain apart is not its size, it is the amount of connectivity. Every brain part connects to every other brain part in mammoth ways, okay? And some of these things Oh, it's 100,000 miles of connections. True or false? True. All right. That's true. 100,000 miles in like little head like mine. Okay. And this from the same laboratory says something about what those connections are. Now they've been color-coded. This is real science, except for the color coding was not the way it really is. They're not actually green or yellow. They're more pink, blue, purple. Anyway, these connections have been color-coded by computer. And some of these connections do obvious things, like from here on your motor cortex down to your spinal cord so you can move, or from your eyes to the back of your head where you create vision. But many of them don't do that at all. They associate between two areas. The area that thinks about motor cars and the area that thinks about poetry are connected. And there is a point of view that says creativity lives in that connectivity. And if you think about the things that you think are creative, the things you think are wildly creative, the poem you read or the sculpture you read, what you're seeing is things being put together in novel, interesting ways. And in art, I think that is part of what makes into creativity. I don't want to define creativity in art audience, but that's one of the important things that happens is seeing connections in new ways. And there is a point of view that says what allows our brains to be creative is this mammoth connectivity between different areas that allows us to pull things together in new and interesting ways. Okay, why do I tell you about that with regard to these artists? The answer is that creativity doesn't live in a place. It may live in the whole pattern of everything. And there are legitimate theories that the reason why artists can contribute to creative, amazing things throughout their lifetimes is because there isn't a creativity center that you can just make go away. In fact, the brain is a creativity center. What these people have is something else. They have drive, they have the urge to create, they have the willpower. Obviously, they have decided to do that instead of not doing that. But maybe the ability to see things in new ways is something that lives in the way that our brains are put together. So, answer one, I think that creativity is not necessarily a single brain area or a hemisphere, but it's a property of how the brain areas connect. And this is hypothetical, honestly. It's hard to prove, but I propose that that's a fact. There you go. All right. Now, here's a whole other set of facts. And I told you how we learn things in neurology. Sometimes it's by looking at how things go when things go poorly. And this is an amazing set of pictures of a painter, William Uter Molin, who decided upon receiving the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease to create a series of self-portraits. And they're moving and spectacular. This is obviously well before, but this is the time of the diagnosis, and this is every year after that. And this is well publicized, and you can read about it and see it online. And from people who are experts in the Alzheimer's area, they say there's some patterns here that are typical of this kind of dementia. There's a loss of color. There is a loss of complexity. Things become more simple. There's a loss of the kind of, there's an artistic expression kind of changes and becomes simpler and less. And that fits a little bit of how we experience Alzheimer's as well. It's sort of progression of less. And I'll just compare this. This is Alzheimer's, which is the most common cause of dementia. Dementia is memory loss and cognitive decline that affects you in a serious way. And there's a neurologist named Bruce Miller who has been studying a different kind of dementia, not as common, called frontotemporal dementia. And he noticed something really interesting. Some of his patients became intensely creative after the diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia. And he documented, this is one person who had been doing sort of fairly typical artistic expressions derived from Asian art, and her work becomes more creative and more colorful and more wild. And some of these people have done sort of work that you just have to look at it to recognize they are really becoming more and more extremely different. And they seem to be not just more creative, but just massively so. They're compelled to do it. They do many, many, many paintings or drawings or whatever. They have just this huge productivity, torrents of creativity in the New York Times. And so the theory here is kind of interesting, which is that this particular dementia is a loss of inhibition. It's the things that all children can paint, all children can dance, and then we stop, right? And it's our brain, our censoring brain says, that looks terrible, you're an awful dancer, you can't be a poet. And you say, don't do it, right? That circuit is lost in these people. They're a little impulsive and disinhibited. Their frontal connections have been lost. This is a disease of that. And the thinking is, it's a release of what might be the living creative drive to creation, or the creative thing that lives in all of us, especially in these people, which has been released by the loss of the inhibitory stuff that we all carry with us, which I think is a really interesting framework. So, well, it turns out there is an example for music. So Charles Limb, who is an ENT doctor and was really interested in musical improvisation, found a way to put himself in an MRI machine while he was performing on a keyboard, which he had to make MRI compatible. And he did improvisational music, and he got some of his friends and some great famous performers to do the same thing. And there is some areas in red which light up when he's improvising. But look at this. There's a bunch of areas which go down and have to turn off to be improvisational. The self-monitoring and conscious volitional control of ongoing performance. How do you like that? That the idea of the creativity in music is knocking out this exact same pathway which goes on with the frontotemporal dementia. So here's a theory, and it must, well, there you go. Some people, new artistic creation appears to be released by the loss of inhibition or self-censoring. So I think this is an interesting idea. Some people, I'm out of time, some people have this. All right, last thing I'll mention, and I hate to make this so short because it's what I actually work on. Our brains change all the time. What we call changing in the brain is plasticity, that ability of the brain to change. And it turns out we change as we grow, we change as we age, we change when we practice the violin, we change when we experience trauma. That plasticity does not involve growing new brain cells and taking some down. What it involves is changing the way the brain cells connect. And after a stroke, for example, people can get better by changing the map. This part of the brain used to control the hand, and now it'll be that part. That kind of plasticity is really interesting, and what you have to assume is that some of these artists who are especially resilient have the ability to change their brains in order to be creative. And we heard this from Dr. Bell of two people who had traumatic brain injury, her patients, who became painters and became things, and you have to say their brains had been changing. Okay, so plasticity has to underlie the ability of our brains to adapt, even in the presence of serious disease. So I want to conclude, artistic expression is a unique human thing. Sometimes the loss of inhibition enhances art. I don't think it's a single creativity center at all, but the creativity lies in our brain's connections and our ability as people and our ability as neurons to adapt has to do with how connected we are and how willing we are to make new connections. Okay, and with that I say thank you so much. There you go.
While our panel is getting onto the stage, I just want to, okay, Mark, I'm sorry I cut you off, but we have to, where life goes on. Okay, so all of you should come next week if you've enjoyed this. We have our last program on seeing an artist with visual impairments, and we hope you'll join us. And across the street tonight, causing part of the traffic jam, is the opening of Speechless, which is a Different by Design, a wonderful new exhibition designed and created with them, with 6 artists. So it's really, it opens on Saturday, I think, to the public. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to promote that within the Nasher. I'm sorry about that, Jeremy. We're just going to go right into questions from you all because you've been so patient and it's taken longer than we had planned, but on we go. Okay, now I have to get up. Who would like to ask questions? Can you help me out? Yeah.
Hello. Doesn't matter. I am very interested in your molecular definition of creativity and how that works. How do you think pathological diseases like schizophrenia are kind of incorporated to that, and the resilience of something that is essentially an ultimate form of creativity. You're creating delusions or hallucinations, and how the resilience of the mind works molecularly in that space.
All right, we'll share this one. And maybe there's people in the audience who know more about this than I do. So I think we have to get away from the stereotype and the concept, the old style thing that you got to be crazy to make great art, right? We have to get away from that and say, those are different things, right? And some of these artists have been able to create beautiful things out of their experiences being sick, and some of them have because they transcended mental illness. But I think you're absolutely right. When you talk about psychosis and schizophrenia as a kind of psychosis, you're talking about thinking of ideas that don't exist, that are not true, hallucinations and ideas that come from somewhere. And that is the experience that some artists also feel that they have if they're using drugs, or if, I think Salvador Dali used to try to fall asleep in his chair. And that moment where you have of just having really crazy ideas and he'd get up and paint or draw what he saw. And so I think there's something to the idea that this ability to see and experience new things can be something you can use to make art. But I don't think it's the same thing as requiring that you do that to make art. I think that the experience you have, and Van Gogh had it, and Munch had a hallucination about this bridge, clearly is something you could then go and turn into your art. I don't know that, from my reading, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, that those things are actually required to be artistic. But clearly, you would hope that someone who is experiencing schizophrenia or depression or bipolar is able to use those experiences to find resilience. So, and in terms of molecular level, I'm not going to go there. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
I would just simply add that if we know from the research that the majority of people are resilient, we would not exclude people that have a mental health condition. So perhaps their inherent resilience makes them able to cope and manage that better than if they weren't resilient. So that, I think that's where resilience plays a place in people who might have a more chronic mental health condition.
Up front?
Question.
Yeah.
My question is specifically for you, Dr. Anne-Marie Warren. I studied post-colonial literature in college, so a lot of that dealt with trauma literature and trauma art. And so the question I wanted to ask you, when it comes to your presentation about using art therapy kind of as an individualized approach for resilience and coping with trauma, is the notion of trauma literature or trauma art like the idea of creating something that represents the coping of a collective group of people? Is that a made-up idea, or is there a case to be made for something that can represent kind of a coping mechanism and help people be more resilient through experiencing that?
So I think I can speak more to the actual use of art in a way that it kind of can be a way that people can talk about trauma and process about trauma when they can't use verbal processing. So I think the Healing Soldiers project that is so powerful with the masks may be a good example of what you're talking about, kind of a group experience in a way. If you go and look at the work that they've done, you see these themes, and that's actually what the research money is going to go to really dissect themes in those masks. So that may speak to kind of the history you're speaking of, but I think there's a collective experience people have that go through similar trauma. And again, the evidence base isn't there the way it is for our traditional talk therapies, but I do know from my own experience in working with lots of people with trauma, sometimes it's the talking doesn't quite get it. They need to do something visual or creative to touch those parts of the brain that were so deeply affected and wounded, and that's what helps move them through and sometimes makes them more open to do the traditional talk therapy. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
The other other part of it is, I would say, because, for example, I never served in the military, but I've been through a lot over my life. Somehow I seem to be gifted at getting in the wrong place at the wrong time. So one experience was I moved to Berkeley. That was a trauma. But then in addition to that, the first day on the job was the earthquake. A year later, it was the fire, huge fires in the Berkeley Hills that almost burned my home and my museum down. And then a few months after that, I was on a plane going to Hawaii for a vacation and to give a talk, and the plane lost an engine on my side. So I actually saw it fall into the Pacific Ocean. And very much to your point, when I said, I can't stay here. I have to give a lecture tomorrow. And the next day, when I was in Hawaii standing at the podium, I completely stopped. And I couldn't do anything but go over this cycle in my head over and over again and realize that planes losing engines and all of the other things. And so that's when I started drawing for my experience. And then more recently, unfortunately, because of my medical condition, when I'm going through a huge amount of pain, like breathing, which I can't do very easily, I have a whole notebook of abstract drawings depicting my pain. Nobody understands what I'm going through. Nobody. But I can show the pictures. And my doctor has a better idea because they're fire, blue with fire, or mostly all fire. So that was exactly to your point. You know, I'm just trying to say there are many of us go through accidents and illnesses that are very, very traumatic. And visualization of that is absolutely a way to begin to understand the feeling of it.
I'm wondering about the effect of medication and therapy on the artistic impulse, because it feels like with some of the earlier artists you discussed, it was just sort of a, venting of their inner lives. But I'm wondering now that we're more cognizant of treatment options, what effect that has on artistic output.
Oh, I mean,
go ahead.
I can't speak from a medical perspective, but I can say that one of the things that Isa Genzken has spoken out about is that being on medication, sometimes she felt would inhibit her creative output.
Right.
And this is something that I think many people with bipolar disorder experience. They feel maybe inhibited or a dulling of their senses and their creativity. And so it starts this endless cycle of going into recovery, staying on the medication, but then feeling inhibited or unable to express themselves creatively. So going off the medication, then having
To go back.
and then having this cycle of so from that perspective, I think medication is something that these artists may be battling with because they know they need it for their treatment, but perhaps I don't know how true it is, and I can't speak for that experience, but I know that this is something that they continually refer to.
Yes, and you saw it. And so, I just selected two of many, but Jacob Lawrence took medication, was in the hospital, was treated both with talking therapy, I guess I would say, and then with medication. And he documented those pictures to show the process of healing for himself. And so none of those are scary to him. But I know Jake very well, and I know that later he never had a relapse, that was what was accomplished. Individuals like Isa Genzken, and there are many others who suffer through Kusama, they have to balance the two experiences and then try to keep their most of them are motivated to keep their creativity front and center. And the treatments have changed vastly. We'll take one more question, Anna. Is that okay?
Sure. Bonnie, you pick.
No, I won't do that.
You're right here, so.
I would like to know do you all know about magnetic stimulation?
Maybe
how does that affect creativity in a person?
I can't answer
okay.
that.
I can answer that.
Wait, before you
I
answer
can.
it,
No,
can
I
you
can. I
explain
have a
what it
definitive
is?
answer because
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Okay.
So I can say that with some certainty. Let me just tell you what it is. One of the ways that we are learning that we can affect the brain and how it works is externally to stimulate the brain using electrical or magnetic fields.
Right.
And sometimes that is used in order to change a disease or to improve performance. And there are studies, in a whole bunch of them, about this in creative tasks that are done in a lab. And so I can tell you that there have been some where applying a pulse at this time would turn off the ability to be creative in a certain way or to turn it on. So there's ideas that from the outside of the head, you can't influence the things going into the head. I don't know anything about how it's been used and how you would even think about trying to bring out the expression of creativity, which is really so much a artistic creativity, which is so much of a personal thing. The kind of creativity they're doing in labs is a problem-solving thing, being able to see things in a different way.
Well, the only way I
yeah.
know it is that it's supposed to help with depression.
Yes, so that's,
And
yeah.
so if you're depressed, maybe you're not as creative as you could be if you weren't.
I think
Or
that.
you dealt with it and
Sure.
got healed.
I think that's right. There are kinds of transcranial magnetic stimulation, other kinds of brain stimulation which are helpful for depression. And I don't know anything about how that affects creativity. The kinds of things I'm thinking about are used in a lab to try to probe, does this brain area contribute to creativity or does this brain area do it? Because you can momentarily turn it up or turn it down a little bit.
All right, what I noticed from your lecture, or this images that we saw, the TMS is supposed to hit the serotonin and the good feeling chemicals that are made in your brain.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that on any of the images.
So
Well, not necessarily from you, but
yeah.
through anybody's talk.
So I think this is really an amazing new era of medicine and science that we need to understand better, which is how do we change our brain connections in a way that's good and not evil. And, I think that whenever you're doing something and trying to have it be a therapeutic thing, you also need to look out and see what are the possible adverse effects. And the history of medicine is just littered with opportunities to try to change brain circuits in ways that didn't work out so well. And, I think that this idea there's a new ability to change the way the brain works, not just with medicines, but also with electrical circuits and deep brain stimulation, external brain stimulation, is a terrific opportunity to try to make people better. And one of the things that you constantly have to look out for is, are we making people, are the side effects ones which we would consider important, like creativity would be one.
With that, we want to say thank you for tonight. You've all been extremely patient, but we hope you've enjoyed the evening. I want to thank the director of the Nasher, Jeremy Strict, who encouraged me to keep going with this project, and Anna, Anna, where are you? Anna Smith over there, who is my partner at arms and has made this manifestation come through, and of course to Leigh and all the curators and the wonderful doctors who have contributed such a different perspective. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll come back next week.